Americans have no idea what's happening right now in New York City. Over the weekend, the United Nations member states are gathering in the Big Apple at the UN headquarters for the historic Summit of the Future, as they're calling it. Their intention at this summit is to sign what's being called the Pact for the Future. So these globalists are getting together and signing something that perhaps you didn't sign off on. What's actually in this Pact for the Future? Let's ask Derrick Broze, investigative journalist from The Last American Vagabond, who's been in New York and covering what's going on at the summit, and is going to break this all down for us. Now, you've been covering this for a few months, looking, Derrick, at the previews, the draft resolutions of this Pact for the Future. Why should we be concerned what these guys are voting on right now?
Yeah, thank you for that, Clayton. So the reason Americans and really people all over the world need to know about this is because in minor resistance way, all of the major nations you would expect are on board. The Pact for the Future is calling for a few main things. The first part is to include an emergency platform, and this emergency platform would allow UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres to declare an emergency at any point. It's very similar to what we saw in the language of the pandemic agreement, the pandemic treaty, that people were resistant, but unfortunately there's less awareness about this. What the language says specifically, that if there are quote, global shocks, which shock multiple regions of the world, then they could invoke this emergency platform, which would give the UN more powers to act. Now, what exactly would come from that, we don't know, because unfortunately, we have seen three drafts that have been released previously, the most recent one on August 27th. But as of this recording and as we're going into the summit, there has been no final version released to the public. And I think this is being done on purpose. So that's one, of the scary, worrisome aspects, is we're not even seeing what they potentially sign, even though we really have no say. These people are unelected. So they're not even letting the public know what's going on. But the versions we have seen before specifically state that there needs to be an emergency platform. And when they talk about shocks, this could include a new claimed pandemic. This could include war, economic turmoil, famine. Really, it's an endless. Obviously, climate change is on that list, but it's a pretty endless list of whatever they want to claim. They then invoke this emergency platform as part of the Pact for the Future. And then what comes next, none of us really know, but definitely what they are trying to do is to give the UN more power. There's discussions around UN 2.0, that it's time to remake the UN because, we're at the 80th anniversary. We're nearing the 80th anniversary of the UN, and it's just not doing what it used to do. There's also, of course, this whole thing is a major push towards a global government. They don't like to use those terms. They prefer multilateralism or global governance. But at the end of the day, it's the same thing. It's a more empowered UN to act, to compel nations to do whatever they want. And so we might see some major steps towards remaking the UN this weekend as well. And then the other important aspect that we can get into further is the financial aspect. They keep discussing the need for a new Bretton Woods moment. And of course, Bretton Woods is the post-World War II creation of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. Those are known as multilateral development banks. This language of the draft definitely says we need to empower and to increase and to transform these multilateral development banks. And for those who know the history of this, or if you've read John Perkins' Confessions of an Economic Hitman, you know that those banks have been used to rob and extort third world developing countries around the world for decades now and get them in debt and take their resources. So they want to inject more financial resources into this. And part of that as well is to transform the financial system. In my view, this is just another step of the Great Reset that we saw announced in 2020.
So many things to unpack here, Derrick. I want to let's touch on the financial piece of this. I think you're absolutely right about this. As we see this past week, of course, the Fed rate cuts in the United States. This is the decline. This is really, to my mind, the end of the Bretton Woods Agreement in a lot of ways. You're seeing, of course, the moves towards BRICS currency right now move away from the United States dollar as the hegemonic power to use the IMF, the World Bank, to bully nations around the world. And a lot of countries have had enough of this, and they're moving away from this. So it would be interesting to see the players behind the scenes here at the United Nations, who's trying to push and make this push for maybe a Bretton Woods Agreement 2.0. Is it the United States? Is it Russia? Is it Brazil? Is it the BRICS nations? I think this is a really interesting piece of the puzzle here. What do you make of that?
Well, you're correct on including the BRICS conversation there, because next month will be the BRICS summit, which we should keep our eye on as well. It does seem from some of the players that there is an effort to push away from the U.S. being the singular power driving force within the UN, and depending on your perspective, that might be a good or a bad thing. But I do think that that's part of this effort. There, many of the discussions and the conversations I've watched leading up to the summit have been about trying to give voice to other countries. And, that doesn't inherently mean anything negative per se, but I do think it is a shift away from trying to have the US being the only controlling power. Now, of course, if that goes towards China being the controlling power, then that could be problematic. And I don't think overall, though, whether it's the UN or the US driving the vehicle, or China driving the vehicle, or Russia, that it's going to be good for the average person on the ground level.
Well, and the average person on the ground level when it comes to these crazy climate policies or whatever lockdown procedures they want to put in place for their next pandemic piece of the puzzle, it's only going to benefit the elites, and we will all be screwed as a result of it. So I was going through the draft resolution of the August 28th, most recent draft resolution of this pact for the future. And of course, they want to accelerate the Paris Climate Accords agreement, trying to push for this reduction of 1.5 degrees Celsius, even though there's zero evidence that would in fact be bad for the Earth, and in fact zero evidence that we're even going to hit a sort of a disastrous moment. We have this world doomsday clock that the King Charles stood behind and rolled out, that in like 7 years or whatever, we're going to hit doomsday if we don't get back this 1.5 degrees Celsius. So they want to accelerate that plan for all of us. What will that mean? I mean, what will that mean for the average person traveling? Carbon passports, like what is your carbon footprint? Oh, you've traveled too much this month. That's where my mind goes.
I think that's absolutely where this is going, Clayton. And you mentioned King Charles. Well, I should remind everybody that back when he was Prince Charles in 2020, he was part of the initial announcement of the Great Reset, as well as the head of the IMF. This is, as I said, just a continuation of those same policies, and climate change, the climate narrative absolutely factors into this. I'll also mention that some of the key players behind this who are going to be present would include the World Economic Forum as well as the Club of Rome. They have been calling for the UN to declare a planetary emergency as part of the Pact for the Future at the Summit of the Future. Again, we haven't seen the final language to know if that is going to be included in there. We know there's a discussion of an emergency platform, but the Club of Rome has been calling for a declaration of a planetary emergency since at least 2019, before COVID even happened. And they've been through the various funding mechanisms. There's an organization called the Stimson Center, which is funded by the Rockefeller Foundation and the Gates Foundation, and others, the Climate Governance Commission. All these bodies have been calling on the UN to declare a planetary emergency at the Summit of the Future. That, to me, is the biggest concern. I don't know if it's going to happen just yet, but they absolutely are trying to say, look, we're already in that state of emergency. Go ahead, declare it now. And then again, who knows what powers they try to grab once that happens. You sort of hinted at some of those things: carbon wallets, limiting of movement and limiting of what you can put on your dinner plate, things like that. We know those things have been discussed and are on the table. I fear that if this does go forward, and of course, there's not too many people paying attention to this. I'm searching every single day, even in the corporate media. It's almost as if they don't want to even talk about it until it's done, so the public doesn't have a chance to sort of rally and push back. But that's part of why I'm going to New York City, to be there live in person reporting. I will actually be able to be inside the UN building for at least 2 days. I did get access, and we're going to be rallying outside the building. But I think it's purposely being downplayed and ignored, except for those sort of key players who are kind of already in that world. But the public at large has no idea this is even happening.
Well, hopefully we can bring some awareness to this a few days ahead of this summit in New York City over the weekend. I'll get you out of here on this, Derrick, which is the pandemic piece of this. So we talk about the global health emergency. They're going to declare a global financial emergency. They'll declare a global environmental emergency. And then, of course, they'll declare a global pandemic emergency for new lockdown procedures and all of this. And this is why they were keeping, of course, the WHO's latest pandemic treaty quiet, and we weren't allowed to see draft resolutions and changes to the WHO pandemic treaty ahead of time, right? It was sort of like almost released right at the day they were voting on these things. So we didn't get advanced copies for a lot of these things because they were deeply troubling and deeply worrying. Do you think that's what's going on here as it relates to global health emergency?
Absolutely. I think it's the same tactics that they are trying to keep it under wraps. And, thankfully, there is, as I kind of alluded to earlier, some pushback from some of the developing nations. I wouldn't say they have the same concerns we have, but there definitely are developing nations, Cuba and some African nations that I've seen who have spoken up and say, we're being totally ignored. Our voices are not being heard on this. Now, that doesn't mean they're not going to sign, but I do think that this late release of the draft, if we even see the final version before it's signed, is so that there can't be enough time for people to kind of put up resistance and organize against it. And I do want to mention this just for anybody at home who is maybe feeling disempowered and wants some solutions. I'm going to be in New York City with an activist named Dan Aston Gregory, who's coming out from the UK. He's a great guy. He runs the organization called Free Humanity. People can go to freehumanity.org/pact for the future. And there's just a simple petition that they've put together. More than a petition, it's a call to action and just calling for organizations, journalists, media outlets, et cetera, individuals to put their name down and say, we don't consent to this. We don't abide by whatever the UN signs. That's something people can get behind. They can put a little action. The other thing I'll just mention briefly, Clayton, is that the weekend after this, we are organizing what we call the People's Reset. We're calling it Our Summit for Our Future. It's a 3-day event live in the UK, but it's also going to be streamed for free on our website at thegreaterreset.org. And for 3 days, just like they're meeting for 3 days, we're talking about solutions, but instead of from the technocratic top-down control paradigm, we're talking about bottom-up solutions, growing your own food, getting off big tech, mental, physical, spiritual health, all the different things that we think can actually empower people now so that we can put our mind and our focus on what we want our 2030 to look like instead of just only reacting and responding to what the UN or the World Economic Forum are doing, kind of inviting people to take the power back into their hands and really see how we can proactively drive our future. So people can check that out at thegreaterreset.org. It's happening the 27th to the 29th of this month.
Wonderful. So many of our audience says, this is so frustrating. What can we do? Well, here's something that you can actually do. You can be, a citizen activist and take to the streets. You can be a part of this. Sign this petition. Activate local media. Talk to local politicians. Make them aware that this is even happening. It's amazing that the UN is keeping this entirely quiet. And in the rumblings of a UN 2.0, like what does that look like? That's unbelievable. Derrick Broze has done some great work on this. We really appreciate it, Derrick. Be safe there and check back with us as the summit unfolds. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Clayton.
Thanks, Derrick.